Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know, if you look at a map of the world today, you see very sharp borders.
Yeah, distinct nation states.
Right. You see clear geometric lines separating one political entity from another. It feels fixed, permanent.
Sure.
But if you rewind the clock to the early 7th century and look at the Arabian Peninsula, those lines completely vanish. You are looking at a vast, harsh desert landscape dominated not by borders, but entirely by bloodlines.
Right. It is a landscape defined almost entirely by movement, by strict tribal allegiances, and by an environment that essentially dictates the parameters of human survival on a daily basis. And the geography itself makes centralized sedentary states nearly impossible in the interior.
And out of that very specific, very localized environment emerges a movement that completely redraws the map of the entire globe.
It really does.
Our mission in this deep dive is to trace the evolution of Islam. We are going to follow its trajectory from a 7th century movement in the Arabian Peninsula into a vast global civilization.
So we are talking about the formation of massive empires, intricate administrative structures, and substantial scientific advancements.
Exactly. Advancements that fundamentally altered the course of human history. We will be drawing on a substantial stack of sources for this. We have historical texts, academic analyses, and encyclopedic records that detail the political, social, and cultural transformations spanning 14 centuries.
Right. We are looking at exactly how a localized movement expanded to encompass diverse populations from the Iberian Peninsula all the way over to the Indian subcontinent.
So we need to establish the baseline. Let's set the scene in the Arabian Peninsula before the year 610. If you were standing in the city of Mecca at that time, what kind of society are you observing?
Well, you are looking at a society that is deeply polytheistic.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it's heavily driven by commerce and economics.
Okay.
Mecca was a crucial hub for trade caravans, moving goods from the southern reaches of Yemen up toward the Byzantine and Sasanian empires in the north.
And it was a religious center too, right?
Absolutely. The focal point of this was the Kaaba, a cubic structure that housed 360 distinct idols.
Okay, so 360.
Right. And these represented the various deities worshipped by the myriad different tribes across the Arabian Peninsula.
Wait, hold on. Are we saying that the religious setup was essentially a business model?
I mean,
The tribes came to Mecca to trade, but they also came on pilgrimage to venerate their specific idols, and Mecca just happened to hold all of them in one place?
precisely. The pilgrimage, known as the Hajj, even in pre-Islamic times, brought immense wealth into the city.
I see.
During certain sacred months, tribal warfare and raiding were strictly forbidden in the vicinity of Mecca. This created a safe zone.
Which is highly lucrative for commerce.
Exactly. And the social structure managing all of this was strictly tribal. The dominant power in Mecca was the Quraysh tribe.
Okay.
They were the custodians of the Kaaba, which gave them both prestige and direct control over this economic engine. Within the Quraysh, you had various subdivisions and clans, such as the Banu Hashim.
Let us examine that tribal structure in a bit more detail, because it is crucial for understanding the stakes of everything that follows. In this environment, you do not have a centralized state.
No, not at all.
You don't have a police force, a king, or a formal justice system.
Right. The tribe functioned as the state. Kinship was the ultimate and, frankly, the only social safety net available to an individual.
So if you were wronged, it was up to your family.
Yes. If you were attacked, it was your clan's duty to demand justice or exact retribution. This system of blood feuds maintained a fragile equilibrium.
And if you didn't have a clan?
If you were unaffiliated or if you were expelled from your clan for some transgression, you had zero legal protection. You could be killed or enslaved with no consequences. You were entirely vulnerable.
That is the world Muhammad was born into, roughly around the year 570, into the Banu Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe. The sources indicate he was orphaned at a young age.
Which immediately placed him in a precarious position within that tribal matrix. He had to rely entirely on the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib.
He grows up, becomes a merchant, manages caravans for a wealthy widow named Khadija, whom he eventually marries, and he gains a widespread reputation for reliability and arbitration.
He does, but the historical records point to a shifting routine as he reaches his late 30s. He begins taking extended retreats to the cave of Hira on Mount Jabal al-Nur.
That's just outside of Mecca, right?
Right. The accounts describe him seeking solitude, deliberately stepping away from the polytheistic and highly commercialized society of Mecca. He would spend days in reflection.
And it is during one of these periods of isolation, around the year 610, that the foundational event of the Islamic faith is recorded.
Yes, the first reported angelic visitation. The accounts state that the angel Gabriel appeared to him with a forceful command to Iqra, meaning to read or recite.
This marks the beginning of the Quranic revelations, a process that would continue for the next 22 years. Initially, he shares this experience and the revelations only with his close family.
His wife Khadija is recorded as the first convert.
Right, and a small circle of friends. But eventually, the message is proclaimed publicly in Mecca. He preaches a strict, uncompromising monotheism.
And this public proclamation rapidly meets fierce systemic resistance from the leadership of the Quraysh tribe.
Now, looking at the history of religious movements, it is very common to frame early persecution purely as a theological dispute. Was the resistance from the Quraysh simply because they fundamentally preferred their 360 idols over a single unseen deity? Or was there something more pragmatic driving the anger?
Well, the theological shift was significant, certainly, but the causal link to the severe resistance was fundamentally economic and political.
How so?
The Quraysh elites profited directly from the polytheistic pilgrimage trade. The Karab was a destination for tribes across the entire peninsula, specifically because it housed all their respective idols.
Right, so if you invalidate the idols, if you declare that there is only one God and these statues are meaningless, you invalidate the pilgrimage itself.
Exactly. Muhammad's strict monotheism was viewed as a direct existential threat to the economic engine of Mecca.
Because if the tribes stopped coming to venerate their idols, the trade caravans would bypass Mecca.
Right, and the Quraysh would lose their wealth and their supreme status among the Arabs. Furthermore, his message disrupted the internal social hierarchy. He was introducing social reforms that challenged the very mechanisms the elite use to maintain their power.
Yeah, the sources outline very specific social changes introduced during this early Meccan period. For example, he forcefully condemned the practice of female infanticide.
Yes, which was a significant shift.
In the harsh economic conditions of the peninsula, burying newborn daughters alive was a practice some families used to avoid poverty. Sons were viewed as tribal assets and daughters as liabilities. The new revelations categorically outlawed this. He also prohibited usury or riba.
The prohibition of usury is a perfect example of why the elite were so threatened. The wealthy Meccan merchants regularly lent money at exorbitant interest rates.
Which trapped people.
Absolutely. It trapped poor individuals and lesser clans in cycles of debt, essentially turning them into economic vassals or even slaves. Banning usury dismantled a primary tool of economic subjugation.
Perhaps most disruptively, the message fundamentally shifted the concept of accountability. In the pre-Islamic tribal system, you were accountable to your clan's customary law.
Your loyalty was to your tribal chief.
Right. But Muhammad insisted on individual, divine accountability. The concept of a day of judgment meant that your allegiance to a single God and the ethical conduct demanded by that God was supposed to supersede your allegiance to your tribal leaders.
That is a direct challenge to the authority of the Quraysh leadership. If a young man from a prominent family converted, he was suddenly prioritizing this new faith over his father's orders and his clan's traditions.
The Quraysh leaders, figures like Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan, recognize this as a dissolution of their social fabric, and they respond with systemic persecution.
And the vulnerability of early converts is starkly illustrated in the historical sources, because the tribal system prevented the Quraysh from simply executing Muhammad.
Because his uncle Abu Talib protected him under the code of the Banu Hashim.
Exactly. Even though Abu Talib was not a convert, he still protected him. So the persecution fell heavily on those without strong tribal backing.
There is a narrative vignette that captures the mechanics of this persecution vividly. It is the story of Bilal ibn Rabah.
Bilal was an enslaved man of Ethiopian descent living in Mecca. He converted to the new faith. His owner, Umayyad ibn Khalaf, was a prominent opponent of Muhammad. To force Bilal to renounce his conversion, Umayyad subjected him to severe public physical torture.
The accounts describe Bilal being dragged out into the desert valley during the absolute peak heat of the day. He was pinned to the burning sand, and heavy, scorching boulders were placed directly onto his chest to crush him and maximize the thermal agony.
The psychological aspect of the torture was to break his will in front of the community. Yet, despite the physical agony, the records state he refused to recant.
He continually repeated the phrase, Ahad, Ahad, meaning one, referring to the indivisibility of the one God.
Yes, his torture only ended when Abu Bakr, a wealthy merchant and close companion of Muhammad, intervened. He purchased Bilal from Umayyad at an exorbitant price and immediately granted him his freedom.
Bilal's story highlights exactly how those without the shield of kinship, like enslaved individuals, foreigners, or the extreme poor, bore the absolute brunt of the early Meccan persecution.
The opposition eventually escalates. When physical violence against vulnerable individuals fails to stop the movement's growth, the Quraysh leadership attempts a collective, formal economic boycott.
Against Muhammad's entire clan, the Banu Hashim.
Yes, to force them to withdraw their tribal protection. From roughly 616 to 619, the clan is forced into a harsh arid valley outside Mecca. The Quraysh draw up a document forbidding any trade, any sale of food, and any intermarriage with the Banu Hashim.
The pressure becomes extraordinarily intense. The sources describe the cries of starving children echoing from the valley.
It becomes so dire that Muhammad advises a group of his followers to seek refuge completely outside the Arabian Peninsula. A contingent of early Muslims flees across the Red Sea to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia.
What is notable about this migration to Abyssinia is the geopolitical dynamic. They are hosted and protected by the Negus, a Christian ruler.
Yes. The Quraysh actually sent emissaries to Abyssinia laden with gifts, demanding the Negus extradite the refugees. They claim they are dangerous societal disruptors.
But the Muslims recite verses from the Quran concerning Mary and Jesus,
specifically highlighting the virgin birth and Jesus' status as a prophet. The Negus recognizes the theological commonalities in their monotheistic beliefs and categorically refuses the Quraysh demands, providing them with state protection.
Back in Mecca, the boycott eventually collapses due to internal discomfort among some Quraysh who have relatives in the Banu Hashim. But the situation remains highly untenable. This period is marked by what the sources call the Year of Sorrow.
Muhammad's wife Khadija passes away.
Right, his primary emotional and financial support. And shortly after, his uncle Abu Talib dies.
The death of Abu Talib is a critical turning point. Without his uncle leading the clan, the new head of the Banu Hashim withdraws the tribal protection over Muhammad.
Which means, under the laws of Arabia, his blood is no longer protected.
Anyone could kill him without triggering a blood feud. His survival in Mecca is no longer viable.
This political reality leads us to the pivotal year, 622.
The migration to an agricultural oasis city to the north, originally called Yathrib, which subsequently becomes known as Medina, the city of the Prophet.
This event is the Hijra.
Yes, it is so central to the establishment of the Islamic community that it was later designated as the starting point of the Islamic lunar calendar.
The Hijra is not just a change of geographic location. It represents a fundamental restructuring of society. Once he arrives in Medina, Muhammad is not just acting as a prophet, he is thrust into the role of a statesman and arbitrator.
The city was deeply fractured by decades of bitter, bloody feuding between its two main Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj.
Muhammad implements a document known as the Constitution of Medina, or the Medina Covenant. So, if we look at the mechanics of this document, how does it actually function? Because it seems to attempt something structurally unprecedented in that specific region.
The Medina Covenant is a highly pragmatic political document. It explicitly attempts to replace the traditional, localized bonds of blood and kinship with a broad-based, ideologically unified community, termed the Ummah.
Okay, so a new type of community.
Right. It brought together the local Arab tribes of Medina, the Muslim migrants who had fled from Mecca, and the various Jewish tribes residing in the surrounding area under a single, unified social and political order.
So it essentially created a mutual defense pact. You are no longer just a member of the A's tribe or a refugee of the Banu Hashim. You are a recognized member of the Ummah.
Exactly. It established a framework for resolving internal disputes that completely bypassed the traditional reliance on tribal blood feuds. If a dispute arose, it was to be brought to Muhammad for arbitration based on divine law rather than tribal custom.
That's a huge shift in legal authority.
It was. It mandated that no single tribe could make a separate peace with an external enemy, and that the defense of Medina was a collective responsibility of all groups, regardless of their specific religious affiliation.
It formalized the transition of Islam from a persecuted religious group into a proto-state entity capable of collective political, legal, and military action.
Which was immediately necessary because the Quraysh leadership in Mecca did not view the departure of the Muslims as the end of the problem.
No, they viewed this new consolidation of power in Medina as a severe strategic threat. It sat precariously close to their northern trade routes to Syria.
The following years involve a series of armed conflicts, beginning with raids on Meccan caravans to recover property the migrants were forced to leave behind, and escalating into major pitched battles.
The military history of this period is extensively documented in the sources. You have the Battle of Badr in 624.
A largely unexpected victory for the significantly outnumbered Medinan forces, which solidified Muhammad's political standing.
This is followed by the Battle of Uhud in 625, which is a setback for the Muslims, and then the Battle of the Trench in 627.
The Battle of the Trench is interesting from a tactical standpoint. The Quraysh assemble a massive confederation of tribes, an army of roughly 10,000 men, to lay siege to Medina and eradicate the movement entirely.
Facing overwhelming numerical superiority, the Muslims adopt an unconventional defense.
On the advice of a Persian convert named Salman, they dig a massive, impassable trench across the northern exposed approach to Medina. They utilize the natural volcanic rock formations to protect the other flanks.
The Meccan cavalry, accustomed to open desert charges, is completely neutralized.
The siege breaks down after a month of bitter winter weather and internal supply failures, marking a definitive strategic failure for the Quraysh.
This period of armed conflict is fundamentally about securing survival and eventually establishing regional dominance. The consolidation of power takes several years, involving shifting alliances with nomadic tribes and conflicts with the Jewish tribes within Medina, who were accused of breaking the Mutual Defense Pact.
The momentum completely shifts in favor of Medina, culminating in a largely bloodless march on Mecca in 629. Muhammad enters the city with an army of 10,000, securing control with minimal resistance.
The sources emphasize the general amnesty granted to the population of Mecca,
including many of the Quraysh leaders who had aggressively persecuted the early community. However, the sanctuary itself was fundamentally altered.
Upon entering Mecca, Muhammad proceeds directly to the Kaaba. He orders the physical destruction of the 360 idols housed within and around the structure.
The sanctuary is cleansed and rededicated exclusively to the monotheistic worship of God. The economic engine remains. The pilgrimage continues, but its theological premise is entirely overwritten.
By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, the political and religious landscape of the entire Arabian Peninsula had been completely transformed. Various tribal chiefs from Yemen to the Syrian border had sent delegations, entered into agreements, acknowledged his authority, and agreed to follow Islamic practices.
Crucially, this included the agreement to pay the zakat, an obligatory alms levy or wealth tax, to the central treasury situated in Medina.
The disparate, historically warring tribes were largely united under a single religious and political authority. But then, in June of 632, Muhammad dies after a brief illness.
And his death leaves a massive, unprecedented political vacuum. He was the prophet, the chief judge, the military commander, and the head of state.
The immediate question of succession permanently alters the trajectory of the religion.
The crisis is acute and immediate. While the community was unified under Muhammad's singular prophetic and political leadership, his passing raises a fundamental constitutional question. Who leads the Ummah now, and precisely by what authority does that person lead?
Because he did not leave a universally recognized, explicitly written directive regarding the political structure of the state after his death.
Right. The sources detail an urgent, highly tense, impromptu gathering at a place called Saqifa, a roofed meeting area in Medina. The local leaders of Medina, the Ansar, the helpers who had sheltered the migrants, were gathering to choose a leader from among their own ranks, fearing a loss of influence.
Hearing of this, a small group of prominent migrants from Mecca, the Muhajirun, including Abu Bakr and Umar, rushed to the gathering to intervene.
They argued that the leadership of the vast new tribal confederation must remain with the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet, to maintain the allegiance of the broader Arabian tribes who respected Qurayshi prestige.
Out of this highly charged negotiation, Abu Bakr, the senior companion and father-in-law of Muhammad, is elected as the first caliph.
A term meaning successor or steward of the messenger of God.
But this election at Saqifa was not universally accepted by all factions of the community, and it forms the definitive root of the most significant schism in Islamic history, the divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims.
It does.
Before we go further into the events, it is vital to look at this purely through the lens of historical documentation. We are looking at how two distinct frameworks of belief formed out of the single political crisis over succession. We are outlining the arguments as they developed to understand the historical impact. Let us start with how the Sunni tradition frames this moment.
The Sunni view, which eventually derives its name from the term Allah al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, meaning the people of the prophetic tradition and the consensus of the community, maintains that leadership of the state should be decided by consensus, consultation, and communal selection.
Okay, so election, essentially.
They argue that Abu Bakr was the most qualified elder, chosen rightfully by the senior leaders of the community at Saqifa to manage the political and military affairs of the state.
And regarding the specific legacy and assets left by Muhammad?
The Sunni historical and theological argument holds that prophets do not leave behind material inheritance for their families. They point to a reported saying of Muhammad that whatever a prophet leaves is charity.
Therefore, they assert that the lands and assets Muhammad controlled belonged to the public treasury, to be managed by the caliph for the poor and the collective needs of the Muslim state. Conversely, let us examine the Shia perspective as outlined in the texts. The term Shia originates from Shiat Ali, meaning the party or partisans of Ali.
The Shia perspective argues fundamentally that leadership of the community was not a matter for public election or consensus, but was explicitly designated by Muhammad prior to his death.
So they point to a specific designation.
They argued that he designated his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, as his spiritual and political successor, and that this leadership should remain within Muhammad's direct descendants, known as the Al-Bayt, the people of the house.
So, their view inherently rejects the validity of the hurried election at Saqifa, noting that Ali and the immediate family were busy preparing Muhammad's body for burial while the political maneuvering was taking place.
Yes. Furthermore, the Shia position on the inheritance is quite distinct. They argue that Muhammad's legacy encompassed both material and profound spiritual inheritance.
Right.
They argue that withholding the material assets, specifically a fertile piece of land called Fadak from his daughter Fatima, was an injustice. More critically, they maintain that the spiritual authority to perfectly interpret the faith and guide the community uniquely resided within the lineage of the Al-Bayt, who possessed esoteric knowledge passed down from the Prophet.
This dispute, born out of a very specific crisis of succession in 632, did not remain purely a political argument over who sits in the administrative chair. Over the decades, it hardened into a comprehensive theology of authority, legitimacy, and identity.
The historical sources point to a specific event later in the century that crystallized this political divide into absolute permanence.
That is the tragedy at Karbala, which takes place in the year 680, nearly 50 years after Muhammad's death.
By this time, the political leadership had shifted to the Umayyad dynasty. Ali's son, Hussein, who was the grandson of Muhammad, refused to pledge allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, viewing his rule as corrupt and illegitimate.
Hussein traveled toward Iraq with a small band of family members and supporters, but they were intercepted by a massive Umayyad army on the plains of Karbala.
The sources detail a brutal siege where Hussein's camp was cut off from water for days. Ultimately, Hussein, along with his infant son, his brothers, and his followers, were systematically killed in battle, and the women of the Prophet's household were taken as captives.
For the Shia tradition, Karbala became the definitive foundational paradigm of martyrdom, sacrifice, and the enduring struggle against unjust authority.
The mourning of Hussein's death permanently solidified the sectarian boundary, turning a dispute over succession into a deeply rooted theological and cultural identity.
But let us return to the immediate aftermath of 632 in Medina. Abu Bakr is installed as the first caliph. However, his authority is immediately and violently tested.
As news of Muhammad's death spreads across the Arabian Peninsula, numerous tribes who had recently pledged allegiance to Medina see his death as the termination of their contract.
They assert their independence, and crucially, they begin withholding the zakat, the central tax. This widespread rebellion leads to the Ridda Wars, or the Wars of Apostasy.
It is essential to understand the tribal mechanism of treaties here. In the traditional Bedouin mindset, an agreement or an oath of allegiance was often viewed as a personal pact between two specific leaders.
Right, personal ties.
Many of these remote tribes viewed their agreements as personal contracts with Muhammad the man, not institutional commitments to a permanent bureaucratic state based in Medina.
So it is almost like a medieval European feudal structure. Think of a powerful medieval king dying. The local lords and vassals on the frontiers suddenly stop paying tribute or sending troops.
They hold back their resources just to see if the new heir on the throne actually has the military muscle to force them into compliance.
The rebellion across Arabia seems heavily driven by a desire to regain political autonomy and avoid taxation, rather than a complete ideological rejection of the concept of monotheism.
That analogy captures the political friction perfectly. They were testing the structural integrity of this new state. However, Abu Bakr categorically refused to view the withholding of zakat merely as a localized political tax revolt.
How did he view it?
In his framework, he interpreted the zakat as an indivisible, divinely mandated pillar of the religion. To reject the fiscal obligation to the community was, by definition, to reject the faith itself. He refused to compromise or negotiate lower tax rates, framing the subsequent military response strictly as a defense of Islam's holistic integrity.
He organizes the Medinan forces into several armies and dispatches them across the peninsula to enforce compliance and crush the rebellions.
The most capable and aggressive commander he utilizes is Khalid ibn al-Walid. The campaigns are grueling, leading to a climactic confrontation in December of 632, the Battle of Yamama.
The forces of Medina marched into the central region of Najd. There, they faced a massive, highly organized tribal confederation led by a man named Musaylima,
who had actually proclaimed himself to be a prophet as well, offering a rival monotheistic system. The Battle of Yamama was exceptionally brutal and highly contested. The fighting eventually concentrated in a walled agricultural enclosure that became known as the Garden of Death.
The Muslim forces from Medina secured a victory, but they sustained devastatingly heavy casualties.
The historical records specifically emphasize a crucial demographic among the dead. The casualties included a significant number of the Hafiz, the individuals who had memorized the entire Quran.
We must remember the Quran was largely an oral transmission at this point. Verses were memorized and recited. Physical writing was secondary and scattered.
The loss of so many primary memorizers created an immediate secondary crisis. The textual integrity of the divine revelations was suddenly perceived to be at risk of being lost forever.
This demographic shock directly prompted Abu Bakr and Umar to take unprecedented administrative action. They commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit, a young man who had served as one of Muhammad's primary scribes, to undertake a massive compilation project.
What was the specific methodology for this compilation? Because gathering scattered verses in a desert environment seems incredibly difficult.
Zayd's methodology was highly rigorous. He was tasked with gathering every single written fragment available, verses inscribed on palm stalks, flat stones, shoulder bones of camels, and pieces of leather.
Crucially, he cross-referenced every single written fragment with the oral testimony of at least 2 independent men who had memorized the verse directly from Muhammad.
This meticulous process resulted in the compilation of the first singular, comprehensive written text of the Quran.
So the extreme violence and political crisis of the Ridda Wars directly catalyzed the physical preservation of the scripture. Abu Bakr manages to systematically reunify the entire peninsula over 2 years, eliminating rival claimants like Musaylima and violently enforcing central Medinan authority.
But this unification of Arabia proves to be merely the prelude to an unprecedented, explosive outward expansion.
The immense military mobilization, the battle-hardened tribal armies, and the newly centralized energy generated by the Ridda Wars could not simply be disbanded.
This military force is almost immediately channeled outward into the territories of Byzantine Empire to the northwest and the Sasanian Persian Empire to the northeast.
Within a few short decades, under the subsequent Rashidun caliphs Umar, Uthman, and Ali, these tribal armies conquer vast territories, taking Syria, Egypt, and entirely collapsing the Persian Empire.
The speed of this expansion is historically staggering, but the internal political unity of the leadership in Medina proves highly fragile.
Tensions over the distribution of vast new wealth, nepotism, and the unresolved grievances of the succession crisis lead to a series of devastating civil wars among the early Muslims, known as the Fitnas.
This internal fracturing ultimately concludes with the assassination of Ali and the establishment of a new dynastic power, the Umayyad Caliphate in the year 661.
The Umayyad shift marks a massive structural transition in Islamic history. The center of gravity abruptly shifts. The capital is moved away from the austere, culturally insular Arabian desert entirely, up to the ancient, cosmopolitan city of Damascus in Syria.
By moving the capital to Damascus, the Umayyads placed themselves in a heavily Hellenized, previously Byzantine environment. Their governance model had to adapt rapidly to manage an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa all the way to the frontiers of Central Asia.
How exactly do a group of Arabian tribal elites govern a multi-ethnic, highly complex agrarian empire?
They were highly pragmatic administrators. They did not attempt to invent a new bureaucratic system from scratch. Instead, they essentially inherited and adapted the sophisticated Byzantine and Sasanian administrative traditions already functioning in those territories.
They kept local Greek and Persian clerks in their positions, maintained local languages for official tax ledgers initially, and utilized the existing agricultural tax collection systems.
However, At the absolute top of this administrative pyramid, they maintained a strict policy of Arab tribal supremacy.
Meaning the power remained exclusively with the conquerors.
Yes, the elite military commands, the governorships, and the highest administrative positions were heavily dominated by a narrow class of Arab Muslims.
This structural inequality created mounting, deep-seated tension with the rapidly growing population of non-Arab converts to Islam, known as the Mawali.
Who expected equality under the religious principles of the faith, but were treated as second-class subjects in terms of taxation and political power.
Despite these severe internal social tensions brewing beneath the surface, the Umayyad military expansion was relentless, pushing the borders of the empire even further, all the way across the Mediterranean into Europe.
In the year 711, an Umayyad commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad lands a military force on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula.
At a rocky promontory that later bears his name, Gibraltar derived from Jabal Tariq, meaning the mountain of Tariq.
It is crucial to note the composition of this army. Tariq's force was not primarily Arab. It was largely composed of Berbers indigenous to North Africa.
Populations that had only recently been brought under Umayyad control and converted to Islam. They crossed the strait and moved into the Iberian Peninsula, taking strategic advantage of a highly volatile civil war occurring within the Christian Visigothic kingdom that ruled the region.
They engaged the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. The sources indicate the Visigothic army was plagued by internal betrayals on the battlefield. It results in a decisive Muslim victory.
King Roderick is killed. The Visigothic military apparatus entirely shatters, and the peninsula falls to the Umayyad forces with remarkable speed over the next few years.
And they do not stop their momentum at the Pyrenees Mountains.
No, the Umayyad forces continue pushing north, crossing the mountain range, and conducting deep military raids into Frankish territory in what is modern-day France. They target wealthy monasteries and cities in Aquitaine and Burgundy.
This northward momentum into the heart of Western Europe is finally halted in the year 732 at the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers.
The Frankish leader, Charles Martel, confronts a large Umayyad raiding force commanded by the governor of Al-Andalus, Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi.
The tactical account suggests the Frankish infantry formed a dense, highly disciplined phalanx that managed to withstand repeated charges by the Umayyad heavy cavalry.
During the intense fighting, Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi is killed. Without their commander, and fearing the loss of the massive amount of plunder they had accumulated, the Umayyad forces withdraw south under the cover of darkness.
The advance into Western Europe is permanently checked. The borders gradually begin to solidify around the Pyrenees, establishing a long-term frontier between the expanding Islamic Empire and the developing Christian kingdoms of Europe.
Now, I want to pause the narrative here and examine the internal mechanics of this Umayyad empire. We're looking at a political entity expanding with unparalleled success across thousands of miles. Yet, almost simultaneously in the 740s, it begins to fracture violently from within.
Why does an empire at the absolute peak of its geographic reach and military success suddenly begin falling apart at the seams?
The fracture stems directly from the very policy of Arab supremacy we discussed earlier. The Berber populations in North Africa had converted to Islam and provided the vast majority of the manpower for the Umayyad armies in the west.
They were the very soldiers who conquered Iberia with Tariq ibn Ziyad.
However, despite their military contributions and their shared faith, they were consistently treated as inferior clients by the Arab elite sent from Damascus. They were subjected to heavier taxation and received a significantly smaller share of the spoils of war.
So the universal egalitarian message of equality within the Islamic Ummah clashed violently with the administrative reality of ethnic hierarchy and financial exploitation.
Precisely. The economic and social inequity became intolerable. This triggered a massive, highly destructive populist uprising known as the Berber Revolt, beginning in North Africa in 740.
It was a severe existential threat to the entire Umayyad presence in the Western Mediterranean. How does the central administration in Damascus respond to losing control of half of North Africa?
The Caliph responds with overwhelming force. He dispatches heavy Syrian cavalry regiments known as the Jinns. These were the elite, battle-hardened core of the Umayyad military machine, sent west to quell the uprising and restore order.
Do these elite regiments succeed?
They managed to stabilize the situation in certain key areas of North Africa, but the unintended consequences are entirely destabilizing for the broader region. Many of these heavily armed Syrian Junds eventually cross over the strait into the Iberian Peninsula into Al-Andalus, seeking refuge or land.
Once they arrive, they realize they are a massive distance from the authority of the caliph in Damascus.
They begin carving out their own autonomous, chaotic military fiefdoms. They start fighting violently amongst themselves, clashing with the earlier Arab and Berber settlers over territory and resources.
The central authority of Damascus over its westernmost province effectively evaporates into anarchy.
This provincial fragmentation and military anarchy in the extreme west merely mirrors a much deeper systemic rot developing in the east. The widespread resentment among non-Arab Muslims, particularly the highly educated and historically powerful Persians in the eastern provinces, fuels a massive, well-coordinated revolution that completely overthrows the Umayyad dynasty.
We enter the year 750 and the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Revolution began in the eastern region of Khorasan.
They masterfully capitalized on the widespread discontent with the Umayyads' strict Arab-centric policies. They promised a return to a more pious, egalitarian Islamic ideal, rallying the Persian Mawali, disgruntled Arab factions, and Shia sympathizers under a unified banner against Damascus.
And once they seize power, their very first major geopolitical move signals a complete and permanent reorientation of the empire. They completely abandon Damascus.
They move eastward and build an entirely new capital city from scratch, located on the fertile banks of the Tigris River, the city of Baghdad.
Moving the capital to Baghdad was a profound strategic pivot. It shifted the political and cultural center of gravity away from the Mediterranean focus of the Umayyads and positioned it squarely within the former Sasanian heartlands. Baghdad was designed as a massive, circular city representing a cosmic center of power.
The governance model shifts significantly alongside the geography. It is no longer just a small clique of Arab tribal elites from Syria calling all the shots.
The Abbasids implement a highly centralized, complex bureaucratic system that is heavily influenced by ancient Persian administrative models. The role of the vizier, or chief minister, becomes central to managing the sprawling state apparatus.
Most importantly, they actively integrate diverse ethnicities into the administration based on merit and capability rather than pure bloodline. Persian administrators manage the treasuries, Turkic military commanders began leading the armies, and scholars of various backgrounds are brought directly into the state patronage system.
This deliberate inclusivity, this pooling of diverse regional talents, sets the stage for an era of unprecedented intellectual flourishing that stretches roughly from the 8th to the 14th centuries. In Baghdad, under the patronage of immensely wealthy caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, we see the formal establishment of the House of Wisdom.
The House of Wisdom functioned as a massive, state-sponsored repository of knowledge, a functioning academy, and a highly organized translation center.
The Abbasid caliphs heavily patronized what historians call the translation movement. This was a systematic, well-funded effort to seek out and translate Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq were purportedly paid the weight of translated books in solid gold.
Now, looking back at this period, it is easy to view this as just a massive, passive clerical exercise. Were they simply acting as a giant library, just translating and preserving ancient Greek texts for storage, or were they actively creating new scientific frameworks?
The translation process was merely the foundational step. The Muslim scholars, along with Christian and Jewish scholars working in Baghdad, did not simply act as passive custodians of ancient knowledge. They rigorously tested the texts, debated their premises, and heavily expanded upon them.
They identified mathematical flaws in Greek models. They synthesized completely disparate cultural systems, for instance, taking the geometric principles of the Greeks and combining them with the numerical systems of India to construct entirely new scientific paradigms that had never existed before.
The specific scientific contributions outlined in the historical records cover a broad scope. Let us examine mathematics. We have the figure of Al-Khwarizmi.
Al-Khwarizmi is an absolutely foundational figure in the history of mathematics. Working in the House of Wisdom, he formulated the structural rules of algebra. In fact, the English word algebra is a direct derivation from the title of his definitive work, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabra wal-Muqabala.
The term algebra physically refers to the completion or the restoration of broken parts, describing the process of balancing equations by moving terms from one side to the other.
Furthermore, the very word algorithm is a Latinized derivation of his name, algorithmi, reflecting his introduction of Hindu-Arabic numerals, the numbers 1 through 9, and the concept of zero, and his development of systematic step-by-step calculation methods.
In astronomy, the advancements are equally critical. We have Al-Battani. He takes the complex planetary models developed by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy, but he does not just accept them, he refines them with extreme observational precision.
Working entirely without the aid of modern telescopes, utilizing highly calibrated astrolabes and massive quadrants, Al-Battani calculated the exact length of the solar year to be 365 days, 5 hours, 46 minutes, and 24 seconds.
His complex observations of planetary motion were precise and served as the essential foundational data tables for later astronomers, heavily influencing figures like Copernicus in Renaissance Europe centuries later.
When we look at medicine, the shift toward rigorous empirical observation becomes very clear. We have Al-Razi, who relies entirely on direct clinical observation in hospitals to achieve the very first medical differentiation between the symptoms of measles and smallpox, providing distinct diagnostic criteria.
And then you have the polymath Ibn Sina, widely known in the West as Avicenna.
Ibn Sina compiled an exhaustive, multi-volume work called the Canon of Medicine. This was a monumental encyclopedic text that systematically synthesized all previous Greek, Indian, and Islamic medical knowledge, combined with his own extensive empirical clinical findings.
It standardized the testing of new drugs, established protocols for quarantine, and detailed the anatomy of the human eye. The canon remained a primary, authoritative medical textbook in both the Islamic world and in the foremost European universities well into the 17th century.
And in the fields of physics and optics, a scholar named Ibn al-Haytham is conducting physical experiments that fundamentally alter how humanity understands the nature of light and vision.
Prior to Ibn al-Haytham's work, the prevalent theory inherited from the Greeks, supported by intellectual figures like Euclid and Ptolemy, was the emission theory. This theory essentially posited that human eyes function like lanterns, emitting invisible rays of light that struck objects to perceive them. Ibn Haytham fundamentally rejected this premise.
How exactly did he disprove a theory that had been accepted for over 1,000 years?
Through highly controlled physical experimentation, he utilized the concept of the camera obscura, or the pinhole camera. He set up experiments in darkened rooms, allowing light from multiple lanterns outside to pass through a tiny hole into the room.
He observed that the light rays traveled in straight lines and projected an inverted image on the opposite wall. By mathematically analyzing the refraction of light through glass spheres, he definitively proved the intromission theory, that vision occurs strictly because external light rays bounce off objects and physically enter the eye.
His comprehensive text, the Book of Optics, is considered a pioneering work in the historical development of the strict scientific method, prioritizing repeatable experiments over philosophical assumption.
It is important to note that the advancements were not just in the hard sciences. The cultural and artistic innovations during the Abbasid period are immense. This is the era that develops classical Arabic poetry into highly complex codified forms.
It is the era that gathers and compiles the 1001 Nights, synthesizing ancient Persian, Indian, and Arab folktales into a sprawling, interconnected narrative masterpiece that explores human psychology, governance, and morality.
And underpinning all of this vast intellectual and administrative output is a singular, crucial industrial innovation. Following a military clash with the Tang dynasty of China at the Battle of Talas in 751, the Abbasids acquired the technology of papermaking, purportedly from captured Chinese artisans.
The technological transition from utilizing highly expensive animal skin parchment to producing relatively cheap plant-based paper fundamentally revolutionizes the mechanics of society. How exactly does this change things on the ground in Baghdad?
It completely democratizes access to knowledge. Parchment required slaughtering a flock of sheep to produce a single book, making texts luxury items for the extreme elite. Paper could be mass-produced from flax and hemp.
This allowed for the rapid, inexpensive mass production of books. It led to the creation of vast public and private libraries across the empire, facilitated the massive bureaucracy required to run the state, and created a thriving commercial book market in the souk of Baghdad. Information could now travel further and faster than ever before.
This golden age of Baghdad-centered cosmopolitanism and intellectual output persists for centuries. However, the political reality is that the Abbasid Caliphate slowly fragments.
The central power of the caliph wanes over time, as various regional governors and Turkic military commanders establish their own autonomous regional dynasties. Yet, Baghdad remained the symbolic and cultural heart of the Islamic world.
But that heart faces a catastrophic conclusion. It is utterly destroyed in the year 1258.
The Mongol sack of Baghdad. The Mongol armies, commanded by Hulagu Khan, surrounded the city. When the caliph refused to surrender, the Mongols breached the walls. The sources describe the event as an unparalleled trauma for the Islamic world.
The city is systematically decimated over weeks. The civilian population is slaughtered, the grand architecture is leveled, and crucially, the contents of the massive libraries, the accumulated knowledge of centuries, are thrown into the Tigris River.
The accounts claim the river ran black with the ink of countless manuscripts. The era of the unified, Baghdad-centric classical caliphate comes to a definitive, violent end.
But the narrative of this civilization does not end in the ruins of Baghdad, because while the eastern heartland was being devastated, a parallel, highly vibrant cultural hub had been thriving for centuries in the far west, back in Iberia. We need to shift our focus geographically back to Al-Andalus.
Yes. To understand this, we must rewind back to the year 750. When the Abbasids successfully overthrew the Umayyads in Damascus, they ruthlessly attempted to eradicate the entire Umayyad bloodline to prevent any future political challenge. They hunted down the princes.
But one singular survivor managed to escape the slaughter. His name was Abd al-Rahman I, later known as the Immigrant or the Falcon of the Quraysh.
His journey is a tense historical narrative of survival. He flees the massacres in Syria, swimming across the Euphrates River under arrow fire. He travels completely undercover across the vast, dangerous expanse of North Africa, constantly evading Abbasid assassins and spies, relying on the protection of his mother's Berber tribal connections.
Finally, he crosses the strait into the Iberian Peninsula. Iberia, or Al-Andalus, at this specific point, is in a state of near-total political chaos. It is still reeling from the aftermath of the Berber revolts and is torn apart by bitter infighting among the various factions of the Syrian Junds and earlier Arab settlers.
Abd al-Rahman arrives and, utilizing political acumen, begins playing the factions against each other, slowly consolidating a military force. He eventually marches on the provincial capital, Cordoba, which is currently held by a governor named Yusuf al-Fihri.
Abd al-Rahman sets up a prolonged military siege directly outside the walls of Cordoba. Yusuf al-Fihri, realizing he is trapped, attempts a very specific type of psychological warfare to undermine the morale of Abd al-Rahman's tired, hungry, and fractured mercenary forces.
He orders his servants to throw lavish, aromatic feasts every single day, right on the battlements within sight and smell of the besiegers. Furthermore, he sends emissaries offering a highly lucrative truce, which includes a political marriage to his own daughter.
It was a calculated attempt to break their resolve through the temptation of comfort and wealth. But Abd al-Rahman maintains absolute discipline. He explicitly ignores the daily feasts, categorically rejects the marriage offer and the truce, and forces his army to maintain the grueling siege.
He successfully starves out the defenders, forces Yusuf al-Fihri to capitulate, and decisively takes control of the city. In the year 756, he formally establishes the Emirate of Cordoba, creating an independent Umayyad state in the extreme west that definitively refuses to acknowledge the authority of the Abbasids in Baghdad.
Over the next few centuries, this independent state in Cordoba grows into a massive cultural and economic rival to Baghdad itself. It reaches its absolute zenith under a descendant named Abd al-Rahman III.
He feels politically and militarily confident enough to elevate his title, officially declaring Cordoba a full caliphate in the year 929, directly challenging the religious supremacy of the Abbasids.
Cordoba, under his reign, becomes an unparalleled economic powerhouse in Europe and a massive center of intellectual exchange. While much of Western Europe is rural and fragmented, Cordoba is a highly urbanized, sophisticated society.
The sources describe a sprawling metropolis with intricately paved streets, miles of municipal streetlights, running water fed by complex aqueducts, massive public baths, and vast royal libraries containing hundreds of thousands of volumes.
The economic connections detailed in the records defy our modern assumptions about strict religious boundaries. The sources detail robust, regular trade networks connecting Cordoba with the Christian domains of Europe.
You have Amalfitani merchants traveling all the way from Italy to the markets of Cordoba specifically to trade in high-value luxury goods. They are dealing in things like Fatimid-carved rock crystals, intricately woven silks, and advanced metalwork.
It highlights exactly how deeply intertwined these Mediterranean economies were, despite the constant border skirmishing and religious frontiers.
However, the highly centralized autocratic power of the Cordoba Caliphate ultimately proves unsustainable. In the turbulent years following 1031, the centralized state apparatus collapses entirely due to succession crises and civil wars involving Berber mercenaries.
The unified peninsula violently fractures into a patchwork of roughly 3 dozen small, independent, fiercely competitive mini-states known collectively as the taifas.
You suddenly have the Taifa of Toledo, the Taifa of Zaragoza, the Taifa of Seville, and many others, all ruled by petty kings. Now, geopolitically speaking, severe division usually equates to extreme military weakness. These small taifas are surrounded by increasingly powerful, militarized Christian kingdoms expanding from the north. How did Islamic culture in Iberia manage to survive, let alone thrive, during this period of intense political fragmentation?
The survival mechanism is rooted in culture. While the taifas were indeed politically fractured and highly vulnerable militarily, often paying heavy financial tributes or pariahs to the Christian kings to avoid being attacked, they were still immensely wealthy from agricultural output and Mediterranean trade.
And because every single local ruler desperately wanted to legitimize his precarious reign and project an aura of imperial power, they competed furiously with their neighbors through immense cultural patronage.
So because they lacked the military capacity to conquer each other, it essentially transformed into an arms race of art, architecture, and science.
Precisely. If the king of Toledo hired a brilliant astronomer, the king of Seville would offer double the gold to lure him away. The Taifa of Seville, for instance, poured vast wealth into becoming a center for poetry and the production of highly complex lustreware ceramics.
Poets, scientists, and philosophers became highly prized assets, moving fluidly between the various courts, seeking the most lucrative patronage. Culturally, the Taifa period was an era of exceptional brilliance and intellectual output, even as a sense of impending political doom hung over the entire peninsula.
The political vulnerability finally, inevitably, catches up with them. The northern Christian kingdoms aggressively push south in a process known as the Reconquista. A massive psychological turning point occurs in the year 1085 when the forces of Alfonso VI capture the highly strategic, culturally central city of Toledo.
The fall of Toledo sends a wave of absolute panic through the remaining Taifa rulers. Toledo was a jewel of Al-Andalus. Realizing they are militarily incapable of holding back the advancing Christian armies on their own, the Taifa kings make a fateful, desperate decision. They decide to call for outside military assistance from across the strait in North Africa.
They invite in a group called the Almoravids, a highly militaristic, fundamentalist Berber empire based in Marrakesh. The Almoravid armies arrive in Iberia and clash with the Christian forces, inflicting a massive, crushing defeat on Alfonso's army at the Battle of Sagrajas. But the Almoravids do not just fight the battle, accept their payment, and go home to Africa.
No, the dynamic shifts entirely. The Almoravid leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, looks at the disunited, culturally opulent, heavily taxed Taifa kingdoms. Coming from an austere desert background, he decides these local Andalusian rulers are decadent, corrupt, and religiously ineffective.
He utilizes his military superiority to systematically depose the Taifa kings and annexes the entirety of Islamic Al-Andalus, turning it into a mere northern province of his vast North African empire.
The political autonomy of Al-Andalus is extinguished. The Almoravids rule for a time, but are eventually overthrown in North Africa by another, even more austere movement, the Almohads. The Almohads also intervene heavily in Iberia, initially pushing back the Christian advance and winning significant engagements like the Battle of Alarcos.
But the demographic and military tide of the Reconquista proves insurmountable over the long term. The decisive structural breaking point occurs in 1212 at the massive Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. A unified coalition of Christian armies completely crushes the main Almohad forces.
Following that defeat, Muslim territorial control in Iberia collapses rapidly over the next few decades. Major cities fall one by one, Cordoba in 1236, Seville in 1248.
The Islamic political presence is eventually reduced strictly to the Emirate of Granada, clinging to the mountainous terrain in the far south. Granada manages to survive as a wealthy, culturally rich, but politically subservient tributary state to Castile for over 2 centuries. But eventually, surrounded and isolated, it finally surrenders to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492.
The fall of Granada marks the definitive end of sovereign Muslim political power in the Iberian Peninsula, officially closing a complex historical chapter that lasted nearly 8 centuries.
We have tracked the fragmentation of the classical medieval Islamic world, from the traumatic fall of Baghdad to the Mongols in the east, to the slow collapse ending in Granada in the west. But history does not stop. As we move into the 15th and 16th centuries, the global paradigm of power shifts dramatically once again. We see the rapid rise of what historians call the early modern gunpowder empires.
The widespread discovery, refinement, and military utilization of gunpowder, specifically the deployment of heavy, movable bronze artillery and handheld matchlock muskets, completely altered the fundamental mechanics of state building and warfare. It rendered medieval stone castles obsolete.
More importantly, the immense financial cost of producing cannons and maintaining professional musketeer infantry facilitated the rise of massive, highly centralized imperial states. Only vast empires could afford this technology, allowing them to exert strict control over huge territories far more effectively than any of their medieval predecessors.
Three massive Islamic empires rise to dominate this new era. First and foremost, the Ottoman Empire. Their longevity is notable, lasting from roughly 1299 all the way to the aftermath of World War I in 1924. Their territorial reach at their peak is geographically vast.
The Ottomans expand outward from their origins as a small principality in Anatolia. Utilizing gunpowder siege tactics, they capture the impregnable Byzantine capital of Constantinople in 1453. They conquer the Balkans deep into Europe, sweep across the entire Middle East, and secure control of the North African coastline.
To manage this incredibly vast, ethnically and religiously diverse population, they create a highly sophisticated, meritocratic administrative and military apparatus.
The sources mention a very specific administrative dynamic regarding how they manage religion, particularly in the Ottoman-controlled Balkans. Unlike the Spanish Inquisition happening concurrently in Europe, the Ottoman state did not officially mandate mass-forced conversions of its Christian subjects.
No, their imperial system was highly structured around economic pragmatism. The Ottoman economic model relied heavily on the collection of the jizya. This was a specific poll tax levied exclusively on non-Muslim subjects known as dhimmis.
In exchange for paying this annual tax, these communities were granted state protection, exemption from mandatory military service in the core Ottoman armies, and a significant degree of internal legal and religious autonomy under the millet system.
So it was essentially a financial transaction for religious tolerance. But what were the mechanics of this on the ground? Because the sources note significant demographic shifts over time.
The economic burden of the jizya was substantial, particularly for poor agrarian families. It was a tangible, heavy financial weight. Over the centuries, the sources note that many populations in the Balkans, such as in Bosnia and Albania, gradually converted to Islam.
This was rarely through the sword, but rather to evade the heavy economic burden of the jizya, to gain access to higher social standing, and to open pathways into the lucrative Ottoman administrative and military elite, such as the Janissary Corps.
Moving further east, geographically situated in Greater Iran, you have the rise of the Safavid Empire in the early 16th century. Their primary, lasting legacy highlighted in the historical sources is the formal, state-sponsored Shiitization of the region.
Under their founder, Shah Ismail, the Safavids established Twelver Shia Islam as the absolute mandatory state religion of the empire. They enforced this conversion rigorously across the Iranian plateau.
This geopolitical move fundamentally and permanently solidifies the modern geographic distribution of the Shia-Sunni divide that we discussed originating back in the 7th century, turning Iran into the demographic center of Shia Islam to this day.
And moving further east still, we cross the Hindu Kush Mountains to find the Mughal Empire in South Asia, a massive state spanning roughly from 1526 to 1857.
The founder of the Mughal dynasty is a leader named Babur. His historical pedigree is quite extensive. He is a direct, documented descendant of both the Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur on his father's side and the legendary Genghis Khan on his mother's side. After losing his ancestral lands in Central Asia, he establishes a foothold in northern India, heavily utilizing these new gunpowder technologies.
The definitive breakthrough moment is the First Battle of Panipat in 1526. Babur leads a significantly smaller force against the massive army of the Delhi Sultanate, but Babur brings modern movable field artillery and advanced matchlock infantry. He utilizes a tactic of chaining baggage wagons together to create a fortified defensive line on the battlefield.
The opposing forces relied heavily on traditional elements like massive charges of war elephants. The deafening noise and physical devastation of Babur's concentrated gunpowder technology completely shatters the opposing formations. The elephants panic and trample their own lines. Babur secures northern India, laying the foundation for the empire.
Babur's son Humayun has a highly turbulent reign, losing the empire and then spending years in exile in Safavid Persia before eventually regaining it. But it is under his grandson, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, known as Akbar the Great, that the Mughal state truly solidifies its administrative framework. What stands out looking at the sources is exactly how adaptable Islamic governance had to be in India compared to the Middle East or North Africa. They are a minority Muslim elite ruling over a vast, subcontinental, predominantly Hindu population.
The Mughal strategy, particularly perfected under Akbar, was a calculated policy of political and cultural syncretism. Akbar understood that ruling a diverse, massive subcontinental empire required significantly more than just military coercion. It required deep cultural integration and political alliances.
He actively abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims to foster loyalty. He married Rajput Hindu princesses, integrating powerful local warlords directly into the Mughal nobility. He even attempted to formulate a syncretic ethical system that drew inspiration from Islamic, Hindu, Jain, and Zoroastrian ideals.
The sources outline the tangible, physical legacies of this syncretism. It is perhaps most visible in the monumental architecture of the period. You have the construction of Fatehpur Sikri, a massive new capital city built entirely of red sandstone.
The architecture seamlessly merges traditional Islamic elements like grand sweeping arches, geometric proportions, and vast domes with distinctively Hindu structural elements like ornately carved pillars and specific regional ornamentation.
You also see this deep integration in the environmental design, like the adoption of traditional Indian stepwells for complex water management in an arid climate, placed directly alongside massive, geometrically perfect Persian-style paradise gardens like the Shalimar Gardens.
And in the visual arts, the Mughal miniature paintings represent a meticulous synthesis of cultures. The royal workshops combine the intricate, highly stylized, flat perspective techniques brought from Safavid Persia with the vibrant, dynamic colors, naturalistic flora, and emotive subjects characteristic of indigenous Indian art.
It is a literal, visual representation of the empire's overarching governing philosophy of bringing disparate elements into a unified whole.
These three massive gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, represent the final grand phase of classical Islamic imperial power before the onset of the modern era and European colonialism. They demonstrate an enduring capacity for administrative innovation, military adaptation, and cultural synthesis.
We have covered roughly 14 centuries of incredibly dense history today, moving from the harsh, isolated tribal landscape of pre-Islamic Arabia all the way to the syncretic courts of the Mughal emperors in India. We have seen exactly how a single, localized religious movement restructured massive societies, sparked enduring scientific inquiries, and built complex administrative empires that spanned multiple continents.
It is a vast history defined fundamentally by constant adaptation, by the continual synthesis of diverse regional cultures, and by the perpetual tension between universal egalitarian religious ideals and the practical realities of maintaining political power.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, connecting this deep past to our modern world. We talked extensively about the scientific flourishing in the Abbasid House of Wisdom in Baghdad and the cultural and intellectual wealth of Al-Andalus in Spain. Remember when the city of Toledo fell to the Christian forces in 1085? When they entered the city, they found vast, intact libraries filled with thousands of Arabic translations of ancient Greek texts, the foundational works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and Euclid. But crucially, these weren't just copies. They were accompanied by centuries of vital Muslim commentary, mathematical corrections, and scientific expansions. Shortly after the conquest, the famous Toledo School of Translators was established. Its sole purpose was to translate these massive Arabic texts into Latin. This direct transmission of accumulated knowledge from the Islamic world into the universities of Europe became a primary, indispensable catalyst for the European Renaissance and the subsequent scientific revolution. The Islamic civilization that medieval Europe so often viewed strictly as a hostile frontier rival was, simultaneously and undeniably, the intellectual lifeblood that directly awakened its own modern era. Thank you for listening. History Naps, learn history visually.